we are still talking about the government as a fresh government and as a young government, but it already has been 3 months. So in Ukraine, there's a certain meme around how the government works, and it is called a turbo regime. How would you assess that turbo regime? Because in Ukraine, sometimes it looks, it is considered as something critical because too many things are being done in a very quick pace. In your opinion, what are these things and if they are too quick?
Thank you very much for the question. Before I get to the turbo regime, just a quick comment. It is a very young government. Not only it's been in the office only 3 months, but when I look at the composition of the government, it makes me look old because you actually have not only a very young an active prime minister, but a lot of the ministers are very youthful and bring youthful energy, and you have a very young president that is very much behind the turbo regime. And rather than turbo regime, I actually look at it as Ukraine now taking full advantage of a window of opportunity, reform window of opportunity. And yes, and I know that some of my colleagues sometimes we are critical of the speed on this or that measure, but I think that the reform vigor and moving the country to the next level is in general perceived very positively. Now, whenever things are done quickly, mistakes can be made, and I'm sure some have already been made. I'm sure more mistakes will be made, but in general, moving reforms forward is better than not reforming.
Among all the things that have been done, voted for or started getting implemented, what would you name as 3, main things on the path of reforms?
Well, I think that the whole package of economic reforms that were prepared, widely consulted and expected, and were not passed over the last 2 years of the previous Rada, I think in general is a very good move. The law on the economic operators, the unbundling of Naftogaz, the fact that already in the first reading something as controversial and as important economically for Ukraine as land reform has already passed. I know there is going to be more discussion. These are extremely positive signs.
Mm-hmm. I would probably ask you more specific question about the justice reform. It's something crucial for Ukraine because we know that it's not only about just general justice and the feeling of justice which Ukrainians really lack, but it's also the way the institutions work. It's also about how business works. It's also the ties between different business groups and feeling secure also in the country. How would you assess that reform?
Well, I think that moving with justice reform and expediting it is again a very important and very relevant reform for Ukraine. It's important for domestic audience, for people's feeling of that there is no impunity and that the justice system works, but it's also important from the perspective of international investors, foreign investors, right? The ability to enforce contracts, enforce agreements is something that is alpha and omega of any attracting any foreign investment. On the side of the European Union, we have been critical of some aspects of the law that was adopted in Rada. And in fact, during my mission here, we will have series of discussions to see whether we can find room for making some improvements in some of the aspects of the reform that would allow us to be more supportive of it. Because from my perspective, it's a pity that we are saying, if you adopted the law in the way it is, it doesn't allow us to, for example, give international European experts to support it. So we will have a series of discussions to see whether we can find a path to the reform in such a way that would allow us to be more supportive.
Which are these aspects? Is it more about the judges and the way the judges work and just the judicial institution, yeah? Or what is it exactly?
Well, to give you one example is, it's a sovereign right of any country to establish the judiciary in a way it is. When you look at the European Union, you don't have one model, you have 28 models. So it's not something that we would try to impose on any country, what is the size of the Supreme Court or the organization of the judiciary. But if you have institutions already in place that even recently went through a very elaborate and intensive reset effort just recently, it's very difficult to then arbitrarily be changing the numbers and slashing, for example, the Supreme Court to half its size without a proper due process. So nobody is challenging the number of judges you want to have in the Supreme Court, but how do you get from the current number to that target number? That is a matter of proper standards and due process.
Mm-hmm. So it's also about the numbers, but also about the role of the judges?
It's not so much about the number. It's how you get from the current number to the number you set out.
So procedural question, procedural issue. I see. I think my next question is somehow tied to the judicial reform. In the beginning of the campaign, there were lots of concerns towards Mr. Zelensky about his ties or his probable ties to the oligarch Kolomoisky. And we've heard from the partners, within the IMF that there are expectations that Ukraine passes legislation, that doesn't give an opportunity to the former owners of the nationalized banks to get them back. So it looked like sort of a thing you would do if you're not, 100% sure that the judicial system will guarantee that. In your opinion, does the current government demonstrate the distance from the oligarchs? And in which way?
Well, I mean, as far as I don't follow daily the news, but as far as I can tell, the president has been very clear, and the Minister of Finance has been very clear as far as the nationalization of the bank and no plans to give it back or reprivatize it in this context. And I also know of the lawsuits that are being pursued, both in England, in the United States, against former owners of Privatbank about the asset freeze, etc. So I think as far as we can tell, this has been made clear, and I assume that was the basis on which the IMF issued the staff-level agreement last Friday as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the law is still not in the parliament. So yeah.
No, but I think it's even under current legislation, the nationalized bank is a nationalized bank. I don't see a legal way how it would get back to the former owners. Plus, the government has put a very substantial amount of money into the bank to recapitalize it, right? So, in fact, under the pressure of the international community.
Yes.
This was in December of 2016. I remember that very vividly. So I think that the steps have been very clear. This is not an easy situation, but Ukraine is not the only one that deals with difficult banks and difficult previous owners. But it's something that does need, and we all expect, very clear and resolute action.
Mm-hmm. In your opinion, what other systematic reforms could show that Ukraine and Ukrainian government distances itself from the oligarchic system, from the oligarchic economy?
Well, I think that opening up the economy to competition and removing the barriers to competition is extremely important. I think having a functioning anti-monopoly antitrust system is another one. I think very important is to have transparent privatization, because with privatization you are going to bring in international investors, the management know-how, and transparency and competition into the system. That is important. And another important reform is land reform.
Going to the reforms and to the EU association agreement, we have this tool that is now open to the public by the government called the Pulse, where we can really check the progress in different areas. And Ukraine seemed to demonstrate bigger or better progress in areas like human rights, freedom, business entrepreneurship, public procurement, but less, for example, in areas like public health or finance. Why is it so, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, you mentioned health. I mean, this is a notorious technically difficult problem, as well as politically difficult reform. And in this, I would not single Ukraine out. I mean, there are many, many countries worldwide that grapple with difficulties in reforming the health system, both rich and poor countries. I mean, this is a very technically, not a technically and politically easy one. When it comes to, you mentioned finance, depends which part. What you have currently, and this is something where the European Union tries to help a lot with our various programs for especially small and medium-sized enterprises, is that you now have a lot of liquidity in the banking system, but the money doesn't flow easily to enterprises, because there is not enough trust in the system. There is not enough flexible collateral regime, or businesses don't have collateral. So you don't have the guarantees that would allow the financial institutions, banks, to lend easily. So that's where we try to come in with our guarantee programs to guarantee the loans that the banks give, so the money flows more easily. So it depends which areas have which reasons, but as a general answer, there is a bandwidth in any country. There is a bandwidth for reforms. So I think it's inevitable that you do better in some and later get to the others. I mean, I don't think that firing on all cylinders all the time is possible. And but let me just say, look at where Ukraine was 5-6 years ago. I mean, it has really improved. It not only improved, the country is transformed. Anybody who has dealt with Ukraine 10 years ago and comes here now says it's a different place. It's a completely new generation. And it's not only in Kiev. You go around Ukraine. We were the other day 5 kilometers from the contact zone, and a town full of life and entrepreneurial activity and bars, etc. So Ukraine is a different place, and a lot has been done. And it's actually reform pace. You call it now turbo regime. I hope it actually maintains the speed for a while, but it's not going to always be possible to be at this speed. So some things will go slower, some things will go faster. But if I may allow myself to go back to your previous question on how can Ukraine show its distance from the oligarchic regime, I think the one area, and where the judicial reform is important, the one area where Ukraine needs to show its own citizens the break with the past is the ability to show that there are consequences to bad actions. Mm-hmm. And I think that the whole anti-corruption enforcement infrastructure that has been built, starting with NABU and the anti-corruption prosecution, the prevention office, and the high anti-corruption court is something that will show its results, and I think that's also an important bit to show that there are consequences for misbehavior or financial or other